All right. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me? All right, let's go. Now, Una's been giving some jokes all day and yesterday too, so I thought I'd start my talk with a few jokes myself. All right. So, if notorious Biggie Smalls was a data scientist, he would be big data. All right, that worked. Now, what if LL was a big fan of ECMAScript? He would be LL Cool JS. Okay, we're on a roll here. All right, so what if Jay-Z's wife, Beyonce Knowles, was a big fan of style sheets? She would be Beyond CSS. All right, can I get some love? All right, we're gonna get cracking. I like that. So, allô, je m'appelle Henri. Yes, I am French. I did that for the stenographer because I don't know if she could translate that in French, actually. It is spelled with an I. And by the way, my last name is not Helvetica. It's something that I thought was a fun joke for Twitter, but people always ask me every time, is your last name Helvetica? I'm like, no, it's not. And they get up and leave. So, either way, you can leave now if you want, or you could tweet me and tell me how bad my jokes were. All right? All right, let's go. So I'm glad to be back in California, the sanctuary state. It's the safest place in the United States, apparently. And I came down, I was actually in Playa Vista. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay, cool. I was in Playa Vista before I came here, and just for a couple of days, see some friends. I was actually gonna go down and get some running in because I do enjoy doing that, but I didn't have time, and especially because I had a bit of a funny ankle. So I came down here a couple of days ago, and when I came, I went right to the speaker event, you know, to catch up to some of the speakers here, and I ran into Mr. Nathan Curtis. Where are you at, Nathan? All right. I usually don't trust people with two first names, but he's my man right there. All right? Okay, so we met actually earlier, a few months ago. We were in New York at Smashing Mag, and we both actually, I think I saw him with a Garmin watch. I was like, oh, you're a runner? And we started talking and whatnot. And so when I caught up with him, I was just telling him that, yes, I've been running. I had a great summer of training. It was going really well. I had a coach as well. And I would sort of like, I guess, run 3 times a week. I mean, actually, first of all, I'm not a marathon guy. I'm like 5 and 10K, you know what I mean? Or 5,000 meters, if you like to speak on that sort of technical term. Or for the Americans here, 3.1 miles, yeah? Because everyone's like, what is he talking about? 5,000 meters, doesn't make sense. But as I was saying, I kind of ran 3 times a week. Did a long run. I would do this sort of like half and a half run during the week. But my favorite time was always track night, speed work. So I'll do these 200-meter, 400, 800, 1,000, 1,600-meter repeats because it was going to help me be faster, get better at that craft. So as I kept going on and on during the summer, I was really gearing towards Chicago Marathon because on that weekend there was this thing called the International 5K, and I had a goal in mind, and I knew what I wanted to do. Am I walking out of the spotlight? Oh, sorry. And but before I went down to Chicago, about a month prior to that, I entered this one race that's in Toronto, and I was able to break my goal. I ran the 5K in 19 minutes and 20 seconds. So once again, in translation, that's 6.25 minutes a mile. Super happy. I broke the goal that I had in mind, and I'll tell you right now, why did it happen? I mean, how was I supposed, well, again, I'm sorry. I have a bad habit of pacing back and forth, sorry guys, folks. How was I able to sort of like reach my goal and, you know, break it? Well, it was all by design. It basically went all according to plan. I did the training, ate well, rested well. You know, they tell you got to stretch, etc. It all worked out. So essentially, I was able to have performance by design. The performance part was the running, the design was the training that I went through. So, even though I know I'm in a room full of designers, we are going to talk about performance. Because, once again, I do believe that, or at least I don't believe that performance should be something kept to the engineering side. There's no reason why engineers, developers, and designers can't kick it. You know, I don't need to be infirm or colorblind to care about accessibility. Like, I don't need to be a female to know that women's rights are important. Just like that. So, let's talk about performance. So why? Why performance? Why, Sway? Well, performance is important. It's part of user experience. And since we were trying to improve user experience all the time, we have to look at performance and all the changes that we can make to improve it. Now, once upon a time, performance was just like raw numbers. We're just like, man, I have to be fast. So we used to look at DOMCONTENTLOADED. We also used to look at the ONLOAD. But these are like old metrics now. These are not reflective of the user experience that we are trying to convey. So now, what do we have? We have stuff like this. Now, it may look like Mandarin, but it's not. We're looking at things like first paint. When is the first pixel appearing on the site when it's loaded? That's a metric that we're using now. We're looking at first contentful paint. So at this point, we're going to see maybe the background come in, maybe a menu, but there's not a lot being discussed. There's not a lot on the screen. We're also now looking at first meaningful paint. Now, at this point, we probably have a bit more content, like text, the menu's there, the background's filled in. But you know what? How many times have you been sort of like looking at a site and you're like, man, okay, I see stuff, but I can't do stuff yet? Well, that's where we start to look at things like time to interactive. And that is time to when the actual site is usable, AKA when I hit a button, stuff happens. Anytime before that, again, sorry, I'm stepping out the shadow. I mean the spotlight. Anytime before that, sometimes what happens, you'll sit there and hit these buttons, and they're not, they're not interactive yet. You can't do anything, and that's something that we're also trying to improve. The time to when you could do that. So ultimately, this is the one that we always have in mind. So once again, this is all about the performance. This is all about improving that user experience so that your user can load up your site and go about their business. So again, performance became important. Why? Well, I like to refer to the time, this time in, well, are we in November right now? Yeah, we are. So just about a year ago. It was a pretty important moment in sort of like developer web history because at this point in time, the web was being accessed officially more on mobile than it was on desktop. And this is sort of like a worldwide figure, but this is something that is not going to change ever again. I mean, people aren't suddenly going to go back to desktop computers and be like, oh, you know what, that mobile sucks. I love my desktop. No, this is officially here. And in fact, it's also because, you know, some of these phones now are much more powerful than desktops anyhow. But this was an important moment in time because now we are forced to design with constraints because the mobile phone is not what it's obviously not a desktop, and it has certain characteristics that we need to keep in mind. Now, I did mention just moments ago that some of these iPhones, sorry, I let that slip. Some of these phones and devices are more powerful than desktops. But as Alex Russell has vehemently mentioned quite a few times, the average device is a mid to lower tier Android. You have to keep this in mind, because when we are designing with these constraints, we have to make the proper adjustments. So for example, we have to deal with things like the network, because I don't know how many of you have been in here trying to get the most awesome reception. I know I'm not, and I don't know about you guys. And if you guys are getting some reception, hello, I'd like to tether. So we have to work with the phone's capabilities, and we have to work with the network. So this is statistics. This is a few statistics, but this is one stat that performance engineers like to talk about, and user experience people who know performance like to talk about, is the fact that you can lose 50% of your users around 3 seconds. That's just 3 seconds, and if the site doesn't load, poof, 1 out of 2 people are gone. In fact, the average page load on mobile, as per a DoubleClick study, took 19 seconds. So I don't know how many people know what 19 seconds feels like, but we're about to experience it right now. So you can look at the clock up top. Well, what? Yeah. Look at me. Yeah. So I remember when this happened, and the news people were astonished because it was a 19-second handshake, which was a little crazy. But I was like, I got to use this. It was so perfect. But the bottom line is this: some sites are taking on average 19 seconds to load on mobile. So what are we faced with? We're faced with having to work with something called the critical rendering path. And what that is like the minimum amount of CSS, JavaScript, and everything else that we need to load above the fold or within the viewport immediately, so that we can at least provide a semblance of proper user experience, even though the rest of the page is going to load a little further down. So one of the things that you have to do for that is you essentially have to do what Mina Markham said yesterday: keep it simple. Don't overdo it with CSS. Don't overdo it with JavaScript. Don't overdo it with images. You want to make sure that that first load is like, boom, it comes in as fast as possible. And this can be achieved through some design. I mean, if you have like this mock-up where it's going to be a bunch of like stuff going on, fancy stuff, et cetera, and things that are going to take, say, quite a few requests, no. You want to keep those requests nice and low, because here's a gem for you. What do they say? Pro tip. The quickest request is the one never made. Take that in. So, as I was saying, you want to keep the CSS and JavaScript as low as possible. One of the challenges that we have and that we sort of observe on sites and that we want to convey to people as well is that CSS and JavaScript are both blocking resources. And on top of that, you also have the fact that sometimes too much of it is being loaded up and you end up with audits like this. And I don't know if, like, I really didn't want to go into DevTools because I didn't know how it was going to show, but can you guys see the green red here? Yeah, does it show? Okay, cool. So you can see some of these resources here, CSS and JavaScript. The green, or should I say the red, is the scripts that were not used, but they were parsed. Meaning that they're essentially parsed just to use, say, the green parts of the script, and you actually can see the percentage of the script that was used or unused: 73%, 54%. So you're essentially looking at a situation where you're parsing some JavaScript and some CSS that you're not using, but you've used up some of that time, and some of that time is eating into that 3 seconds that we need to retain the user. In fact, here, there's another shot of DevTools. Again, I have to apologize because it doesn't show the best. But you can see some of the JavaScript execution times in the gutter on the left. So at some point, this adds up to about like almost 600 milliseconds, close to a second of just execution time. Again, eating up to that 3 seconds that we desperately need. Now, on top of taking up a lot of time parsing, executing, we have this little green goblin right here, which is the battery. In a study that came out actually a few years ago out of, not too far from here actually, in Stanford, they basically told us that excess JavaScript, excess CSS eats into the battery. These are things that we have to look at. This falls under performance. But again, if you wheel back, there are design decisions that you can make so this can be alleviated. Now, battery is just one of them. I mean, CSS, JS, that's just some of the issues that we have and that we have to deal with. But we also obviously have fonts. I mean, I really can't see anyone, but hands up if you don't use web fonts. Okay, just a few of you. They're outing themselves right now. But the bottom line is this: we use web fonts, and especially if you're going to be a typography type, these things are important. And the thing about web fonts is the following. This is a great quote from Zach Leatherman, a web font loading enthusiast and specialist. Web fonts give us the freedom to read text through the eyes of the type designer. These things are very important. But fonts can hamper the user experience. How? Well, like this. We have this thing called FOIT, which is a flash of unstyled text. This is when you probably have a system font loading up, and you're like, okay, the font's here, and suddenly, boom, it changes into something completely different. That is the unstyled text changing to the actual styling that you wanted. But this is poor user experience, and it falls under performance. But you can make some design changes to alleviate that. We also have this thing called FOIT, F-O-I-T, which is, and it's also got a different name, but I like to use this one, flash of invisible text. And what that looks like is this. Now, this is actually pretty funny because someone had sort of published on Twitter that they had a new site up, and I was like, oh, cool, let me check it out. And I clicked on it, and I just sat there, and I waited for the content to load. And I'm like, it's not loading. And it took so long, I was able to take a screenshot of it and keep it for my talks, because this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So we're on mobile. We're at the mercy of, I don't know if you could tell, but I think I'm on like 1 bar, and I'm on Wi-Fi, go figure. But we're at the mercy of the network, and the funny thing is that the styling loaded, but the font had not yet, because those red lines are underlines, and it's underlining fonts that I've not loaded. These are things that we have to work with as performance persons, and these are things that as a designer and a type person is like, oh man, I love this site, it's all good, the font's ready to go, but it's not loading right. But there are some design decisions that you can make to make sure that this does not happen. Because quite often enough, people just don't know how the font works and how it's being loaded. So that's one element of performance that we definitely have to deal with, the font load. Now, the funny part is that the image actually had even loaded in time, which is totally bizarre, because quite often the image could come in kind of late. Which brings me to images. Now, I could probably spend the rest of the actual conference just talking about images, because there are so many challenges that have come up with dealing with images on several levels. Once again, the network, you know, we're going to see how memory is impacted, among other things. So, and it's also the heaviest asset on the web, which is a classic web performance problem. So one of the things that I feel designers should definitely know about are image formats. Now, there are several out there, but there are really 4 in general that we like to work with. Just give me a quick second here. Can I do this? No, I can't. Okay, I'm going to do that right there. So I'm a big advocate of knowing your formats. And once you know the formats, you can make learned decisions on which ones to use. Like, so we have like the JPEG, the GIFs, yes, the SVG, the WebP, and a few others, like JPEG variants and whatnot. But when we do end up picking the format that we need, the best one, we certainly have to do some optimizing and some compression. Now, for example, who regularly creates SVGs here? Show of hands. All right, cool. So when you create an SVG, you're good. You're like, okay, everything looks good. When you export it and you have like your code, you have to realize that an SVG, quite often enough, you can have like some complexities in there, like, you know, some long decimal places, etc. These are things that you need to smoothen out. Like you can have less points. You essentially want to render the SVG as simply as possible, because the complexities in the SVGs can make it big. Hey, that's a optimization process that we need to go through. Now, and you might use the SVG because, I don't know, you're using it for, say, a corporate logo, et cetera, et cetera. Now, but when you get into raster images, say the rest of the formats that we talked about, GIFs, WebPs, and JPEGs, that's when we get into compression. And compression's absolutely needed because, again, as the heaviest asset on the web, you want to make sure that you compress the images so they load as quickly as possible. And there's like a myriad of examples as to why this is absolutely needed. So one of the issues that we deal with, especially when, say, compressing a JPEG, because again, I'm mentioning the JPEG because it's the most prevalent image asset on the web, we use this process called CHROMA subsampling. Now, who has heard of that? Show of hands, because I'm expecting no hands, which is perfect, but a few of you have. That's amazing. Now, CHROMA subsampling, I'm just basically going to put up exactly what it is. Now, it's the practice of encoding images by implementing less resolution for CHROMA information than for LUMA information, taking advantage of the human visual system's lower acuity for color differences than for luminance. So, that was the Dutch definition. In plain English, essentially, we are playing around with the color information in the photo and not the light channel, because we can, well, let me put it this way, we can get away with it, which is basically why. So we end up, and there was a talk earlier on color, which I absolutely loved, and she sort of touched on some of this a bit. But this is a practice that's used all the time in image compression in performance. So what we end up with is something like this, which is YCBCR, and the value that we're looking for each and every time is 420. The Y is the light information, the other two are the color information, and we've actually meddled with it and removed some color. Now, why this is important is because at some point, if there's no subsampling, you could be, your image could be potentially 2 times bigger than it needs to be. And this is not something that we're comfortable with loading online in sites. But in light of the fact that we are playing with color, there's some challenges here. Now, again, I can't see, but are there any like brand managers in here? Marketing managers? Yeah, no. People who work on retail sites? Yeah, a few. Okay. I mention this simply because with some of the newer devices coming out, we're also dealing with, since we are dealing with color, we're removing essentially some color from the images. Now, for the most part, we can't really pick it up, but there are some challenges. And one of the challenges is the following: wide color gamut. Some of these image formats and some of the screens that we're using, in fact, can cover a wider range of colors, much wider than previous years. Now, I was speaking to an engineer, an imaging engineer, a couple weeks ago, and we were having this discussion about this. And you can end up actually, because since we are compressing and doing some CHROMA subsampling, you can end up sometimes with a, say, clothing item on a retail site, and from 3 different sites, you can have the same clothing item with a slightly different hue. He had pulled up he's a runner as well. He had pulled up a Nike tank top and a purple one, and it just looked different on each and every site. These are some of the challenges that we have to go through as people that work in the performance space because of the compression that we're employing. Now, these are things that also, I believe, that designers should be able to sit on and decide what is best. You know what I mean? Like, you've heard of the challenges where the brand manager or whatnot is around, and they're having this big debate on the type of, like, I don't know, red that they want to use. Now, imagine that you have a particular product and it's out on the market and you load it up on a site and someone's like, hey, the red is off. And thus goes the battle. So these are things that are very important, I believe, and they actually, again, are falling under the whole web performance umbrella because we are the ones doing the compression. Now, with that being said, since we are still talking about images, we also have to deal with memory. Now, this is important because quite often enough, the memory we can run out of memory on a device through the sheer amount of images that we are loading. Now, I was speaking to, I believe it was, his name is Brian. Brian, was that you that I spoke to earlier, if you're still here? Okay, there he is. He had mentioned that I think he was loading up the Airbnb site on his phone, and he was actually a little surprised that there was no sort of like image on the first load. And I'd mentioned that was likely a design decision between potentially designers and developers, and they agreed that, on that first load, we want that prompt experience, so we're not going to load that background image or that hero image, whatever it may be. Also, what ends up happening is, like, again, the more images you have, the more taxing it is on the memory. And there are some studies out there where companies, after having, again, some of these meetings amongst themselves, again, designers in the room, potentially marketing, and certainly the developers, they've decided to go with less images online for potentially a bunch of reasons like performance, but this comes into play as well. I believe, in fact, there's a stat out there indicating that at retail or online retail, sites that had like the best sort of like sell-through or whatnot had lesser images. So this is something that you want to keep in mind. And again, the memory is being taxed by the abundance of images. How am I doing on time here? I think I'm doing all right. Either way, now, and that was the memory. We still have a lot of battery issues associated with the abundance of images as well. In fact, in that same study where that I mentioned, where they said the CSS and JavaScript was sort of taxing on the memory, they actually talk about images and image formats as well. In fact, they just plainly said the amount of energy used to render images is proportional to the number and size of images on a page. So, when, again, sort of like making these mock-ups or whatever it is that, you know, designers and UI people and UX people do sort of like together, these are things and a little bit of knowledge that you can sort of arm yourself with, and hopefully that the developers in that meeting as well, and you could have that sort of potentially long meeting, sort of like dissecting everything that's being done, but this is all being done to provide the best user experience possible. Because once again, from the top, you know, we want to have the quickest load possible. So you want to optimize the critical rendering path. So what does that mean? Having the least amount of CSS and JS that you need on that first load. Then beyond that, you still want to manage the entirety of those resources so that you don't have any, well, you don't have too many excesses that are, again, you know, being parsed for no reason. Then following that, you have to also look at your font loading sort of like management and see what is working best. Because again, you know, you may not need to have, you know, all these weights, these font weights for, you know, just a few lines of, you know, a few headings here and there. This is something that you want to manage well as well, you know, through some font subsetting. Thereafter, after you've sort of dealt with that, again, the images, like I could expand for hours, but images are more and more creating a bottleneck on several levels. Again, from the memory aspect, certainly. You also have, I mean, they create bottlenecks. Hell, I mean, I didn't even touch on responsive web design, where quite often enough, image sizing is done improperly. I don't know what's going on, but my phone's spazzing out, and it's making my watch spaz out even more, so apologies. Yeah, so I was speaking to an engineer at a CDN, and he talked about, you know, some of the biggest mistakes that he sees coming across his desk are through images and having them improperly sized. When they're improperly sized, you're using up a lot more battery that you need to. When they're improperly sized, you're using up a lot more memory that you need to. And again, we got into the whole fact that we do a lot of that CHROMA subsampling, where we play around with the color data so we can make the image size a little bit smaller. But with that being said, with the advancements in sort of like screen technology and whatnot, we have this wide color gamut where you want the best color fidelity possible. So these are things that you have to sort of weigh back and forth. What is most important? I mean, are you, I don't know, Nike, and you have a brand new shoe on and you want to make sure that every detail is shown? Well, you know, that's going to be the priority. You know, or you want to make sure that the site loads as quickly as possible and you want to remove that image. So either way, yesterday, Cameron Mall, did I say that correctly? Cameron Mall? He talked about how this company was able to achieve, this 50-50 gender mix and whatnot. And, well, he said he heard it on a podcast, I believe. And the person on the podcast said they just started to talk about it and things sort of changed along the way. Well, I mean, performance is really the same, you know. Simply because you're on the design side doesn't mean that you can't talk about it. And by bringing these things up, bringing in the developers and whoever else is a stakeholder in this, and having these meetings, this is how you're going to be able to achieve some some improvements in your web performance. Now, he had also mentioned sort of like not being able to fail. And that's very important as well, because I'll be honest, you're not going to nail web performance on the first try. That's like guaranteed. There's so many moving parts going around that you really have to sort of like play around, move things around, take your time, look at some readings, measure, and have a greater understanding of what's going on, and then with time, make some incremental changes, and hopefully you'll see these results like I did when I was training. Now, again, you will fail, like when I went to Chicago and ran, the marathon weekend, I blew a tire, and I had pretty crappy race. And I remember my coach was there, and she was like, dude, don't worry about it. These things happen. And I realized that. But it was a teachable moment. And a teachable moment is what you should take back as well. Take from it as well when you start to make some of your changes. So with that being said, hopefully when you take in all this information that I've shared, you can also eventually achieve some performance by design. And I just want to say merci.
Okay, so...
I mean, we don't have to sit down.
Yeah, we could just stand. It's
all right.
Cool.
I was
stand
like,
around the single chair.
Inside the developer studio.
How can we, as designers, advocate for performance-first thinking throughout the rest of the company? Like lowering requests, that might not be our job, but how can we advocate for that?
I mean, all you have to do is, when the site goes live, just load it on your phone. See how you feel, how it went. And quite often enough, that's the case. Like, how many times have I heard, a site going live and the CEO's daughter was like, Dad, this is loading slowly, what's going on? And suddenly, it's like, he's in the Slack channel screaming. So you basically just have to load it, see how things go, look for like these telltale signs like, images sort of loading really slowly, or that screenshot I had where, the content wasn't there, but everything else was. So these are little things that you can just easily pick up.
Cool. You showed us some Chrome dev tools. Do you have any other tools that you use to test for performance?
Oh, man, this is actually a good question. And I'm going to go back to the conversation I had with Brian. He had mentioned Web Page Test, which is a fantastic tool online. Very raw, not the most awesome to look at. But he also mentioned one that he used called Speed Curve, which is done by a designer and a developer working together. Surprise, surprise. And yeah, it gives you like a very readable chart information that you can actually take back and share with the team.
Cool. The last question is from Twitter. It's from Daniel Peck, who asks, can you talk a little bit more about your placeholder/skeleton loading technique for images?
Oh, you know what? That's actually a good question. And there was a recent blog post from someone I know actually talking about that very topic. So I think they're talking about now having like an SVG placeholder, which I'll be very frank, I'm not a huge fan of, because I think we're potentially complicated things and adding in a new asset just to bring another asset in. So Daniel, is it Daniel?
Yeah.
Yeah, come find me. I think it's an answer that's going to be beyond like just a couple steps on stage, but I'd love to discuss that more sort of like more deeply, really.
Yeah, cool. There's a lot of different techniques too.
Yeah,
so.
there's just, again, too many, and it's like some aren't even that necessary.
Cool, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Okay.